John Singer Sargent was a master at capturing life and form, and today I'm breaking down his approach through a pencil master study of his 1906 self-portrait. You'll see my drawing unfold on the right, while Sargent's original painting remains on the left for most of the video, so you can compare my process directly to his legendary brushwork in real time. John Singer Sargent was one of the greatest portrait painters in history, and he has been one of my favourite artists for years. His brushwork is legendary, his understanding of light and form unmatched. But what if I told you that his painterly approach to painting can also be applied to drawing? That's exactly what I'm exploring in this master study of his 1906 self-portrait. In this video, I'll be breaking down my approach to this drawing inspired by Sargent's techniques, from the first contour lines using the overhand grip to building up depth entirely through tone, just like Sargent would in paint. You'll see my process, and by the end, you'll have a deeper understanding of how to think like a painter, even when using pencil. This isn't just about copying a portrait. It's about absorbing the master's technique and applying it to your own work. I've also talked about this in some of my other sketchbook session videos, so let's dive in. Most of the time I start a drawing like this, my first focus is usually on structure. Before I dive into shading, I prefer to make sure the proportions and shapes are solid, and for that I use the overhand grip, which allows for loose, more flowing strokes and prevents me from getting too tight too early. This is a slightly different approach to starting a master study or portrait drawing, focusing on the shadow shapes and tone immediately, which is what I talked about and explored in my previous video, How to Draw Portraits Like a Painter. I'm not outlining every little detail here, just placing key landmarks: the shape of the head, the outline of the eyes and the nose, the tilt of the jawline, and the general placement of the features. Instead of drawing precise, rigid lines, I break the portrait into simple, straight line angles. This keeps the structure solid but flexible, so I can adjust things as I go. Notice how I keep my hand light on the paper, no heavy pressure yet. That's because I want to be able to make adjustments without committing too early. This stage is all about setting up a strong foundation before moving into tone. One of the biggest mistakes artists make is rushing into shading too soon without having any structure in place at all, which could just be a few faint lines, or lines of value with enough skill applied. This serves as a guide, which value and tone can be laid on top afterward. Some artists rush into shading without having a very good eye for placements of shadow shapes and correct proportions, which can be developed from lots of drawing practice. If your proportions are off, no amount of shading will fix them. So take your time here to at least map out some of the areas and set yourself up for getting the values and tone in the right places. You can also do this by making broad strokes with the pencil, which act as tonal values rather than precise lines. That's why I choose the overhand grip. I feel like it allows me to draw with tone closer to a paint stroke rather than a pencil line. Once some of the structure is in place, the next step is where this really starts to feel painterly. Instead of filling in outlines, I start by blocking in large shadow shapes. I gradually build up tonal value through repetition of shading over the shadow areas, using a combination of evenly spaced out pencil strokes and cross hatching. This is exactly how Sargent would approach a painting, thinking in terms of light and dark masses, not individual details. Notice how I'm using the side of my pencil rather than the tip for the largest areas. This allows me to create broad, soft areas of tone quickly, mimicking the kind of bold, confident brushstrokes Sargent used in his paintings. Then I will go back in with the writing grip to shade in the tone in tighter, smaller areas. At this stage, I'm squinting a lot. Squinting helps simplify the values, reducing the noise and allowing me to focus on the big shapes of shadow and light. It also helps to reduce the amount of color that you can see with your subject. If you've ever struggled with seeing values correctly, try this trick. It forces your eye to prioritize the most important information, and it can also help you to remove the distractions of color from your subject. A key thing to watch out for here is edge control. Some areas should have crisp transitions between light and dark, while others should be soft and blended. This contrast in edges is what makes a portrait feel alive and not overly stiff. And remember, don't get caught up in rendering details too soon. The strength of Sargent's work comes from bold simplicity. Focus on the big shapes first, and the details will naturally emerge later. One of the key differences between drawing and painting is that with paint, you can push and pull edges more fluidly. But in pencil, you have to manually soften edges with careful transitions, and that's where studying a painter like Sargent becomes so useful. Now that the broad shadow masses are in place, I can start refining the features. Even now, I'm thinking in terms of shadow and value, not outlines. For the eyes, for example, I don't start with a hard outline. I build up the depth by deepening the shadows around them, letting the structure emerge naturally. One of the biggest things I've learned from studying Sargent is how he handles edges. A portrait feels realistic not just because of shading, but because of how the edges transition between light and dark. The soft, blurred edges create depth, while the hard edges bring attention to focal points. For example, look at how Sargent handles the transition from the cheekbone to the background. It's not a harsh line. It's subtle, soft, and painterly. I tried to replicate that in pencil by gently feathering the tones rather than creating a harsh separation. This approach also helps avoid that overly stiff, cartoonish look that happens when drawings rely too much on heavy outlines. The more you can think in light and shadow, the more natural your portraits will feel. Having Sargent's portraits next to my drawing throughout this video has really highlighted the key takeaways from this study. Even though I'm working in pencil, my goal was to stay true to his painterly mindset, building up depth through shape and value rather than outline. As you've watched this process unfold, I hope it's given you a clearer idea of how you can apply painterly thinking to your own sketches, whether you're working in pencil, charcoal, or even digital tools. I also want to talk a little more about cross-hatching because it's one of the most powerful techniques you can use to create depth and texture, whether you're working in pencil, ink, or even digital brushes. A big mistake we can make as artists in portrait sketches is uneven, chaotic hatching that either looks scratchy or gets too heavy in the shadows. But if you look closely at Sargent's own drawings, you'll see that he keeps his strokes precise and evenly spaced, even in the darkest areas. This allows the drawing to breathe. It prevents the shadows from becoming too dense or muddy. That's what I've been trying to do here. Rather than smudging everything into a flat, dark tone, I'm layering hatches carefully so that there's still a sense of movement and liveliness in the marks. The way the hatching flows should feel intentional, not random. Another thing to keep in mind is that cross-hatching isn't just about shading, it's also a way to reinforce the form. Notice how I've followed the curve of the cheekbone and jawline with my strokes. This helps create the illusion of three-dimensionality. Even when you're working with simple lines, you can suggest volume just by the direction of your hatching. Of course, while Sargent is most famous for his oil paintings, his pencil drawings are just as masterful, and they reveal a lot about how he thought about form and structure. If you've ever studied his sketches, you'll notice that he often worked with a very economical use of line. He wasn't afraid to leave areas open and undefined, letting the viewer's eye fill in the gaps. It's the same confidence he had in his paintings, where he'd suggest detail with just a few well-placed brushstrokes, instead of over-rendering everything. That's one of the biggest lessons from studying him, learning when to stop. Knowing when to leave a mark untouched rather than overworking it. It's tempting to keep refining and smoothing things out, but sometimes the most expressive drawings are the ones that keep a bit of rawness and energy. At this stage in the drawing, I'm just making those final refinements, adjusting values, softening areas in the foreground with the portrait and the background, and making sure the balance between light and shadow feels right. I'm also checking my proportions one last time against Sargent's portrait on the left. This is always a good habit, stepping back from your work to see it with fresh eyes. A trick that helps with this is to flip your drawing horizontally or look at it in a mirror, because when you see it in reverse, it immediately exposes any asymmetry or proportion issues that you might have missed. Now that the drawing is finished, let's compare it directly to Sargent's original painting. Obviously, one is pencil and one is oil paint, but what's more important is how the values, edges, and structure translate across mediums. Looking at them side by side, I can see how Sargent's control of contrast really makes the portrait pop. His shadows are deep, but never muddy. His lights are strong, but never harsh. That's something I'm always aiming to capture in my own work. This study has really reinforced how much you can learn by breaking down a master's technique. It's not just about copying, it's about absorbing their thought process and applying it to your own art. This was a really valuable study, and I highly encourage you to try something similar. If you've never done a master study before, pick a portrait you love and try breaking it down the same way, starting with structure, then moving into tone. And if you've enjoyed this, please check out my video on how to draw portraits like a painter. I go even deeper into this approach there. Let me know in the comments, which master painter do you think had the most painterly drawing technique? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you want to keep improving your art, don't forget to subscribe. I have more master studies and deep dive art videos coming soon, so I'll see you all next time.